I believe in America. America has made my fortune.
If you study a director's filmography from beginning to end, you tend to notice that most filmmakers with decade-spanning careers see a notable decline in the final phase of their work.
I want to go to China and film a music video called Chubby.
Of all these declines, Alfred Hitchcock's is perhaps the most fascinating. Following one of the definitive filmmaking careers and coming off an artistic and commercial peak, Hitchcock fell into a creative slump best exemplified in his final 4 films. Not only did these movies come towards the end of Hitchcock's life, but also during a transitional period in American cinema where a new breed of filmmaking challenged the old Hollywood guard. This combination of personal crisis and industry changes led to a series of films which were each in their own way trying to figure out what a modern Hitchcock film would look like. Of the 4 attempts, only one was totally successful. What I'm interested in is why. Why specifically did Hitchcock stumble so much in the final decade of his career? Why did Frenzy work, where Torn Curtain, Topaz, and Family Plot all failed? And how do we contextualize Hitchcock's dark age with the rest of his filmography? Part 1. Categorizing Hitchcock. If I'm going to be marking Hitchcock's final 4 films as a definitive phase in the director's career, I should probably consider the preceding phases and how he arrived to this point. Now, any attempt to categorize a body of work as vast and dynamic as Hitchcock's is going to have some limitations, and the phases I'm laying out here are a lot more nebulous than I'm presenting them as. With that said, here is the definitive organization of Hitchcock's filmography, and any deviation is objectively wrong. Phase 1. The Rookie Years. In his seminal piece on auteur theory, Andrew Sarris claims, quote, "A great director has to be at least a good director." Hitchcock's rookie years were about just that, finding out how to be a good director. Though there are some glimmers of Hitchcockian elements in many of Hitch's early works, they're far from fully formed. His most famous film from the period, and by a wide margin, is The Lodger. While a thriller, the film does not create suspense in quite the same way future Hitchcock films would. Hitchcock's whole theory on suspense was rooted in when the audience knows something that the characters don't. A character in danger is one thing, but a character who doesn't know they're in danger while the audience does? Now you've got suspense. But with The Lodger, the focus instead is on what the audience doesn't know, with the bulk of the narrative concerning the mystery of whether or not the titular lodger is in fact Jack the Ripper. The film's visual style is also clearly riffing on German Expressionism rather than forging its own path. Granted, there's nothing wrong with any of this. I'm just trying to illustrate that at this point, Hitchcock's still learning the ropes. That all said, we do see early versions of later Hitchcock staples here, notably murder, a wrong man, and a perverse obsession with women. They feel more like a rough blueprint than a full version, but the pieces are already starting to come into place. But this was by no means the dominant style of Hitchcock yet. He made a wide range of films during this era, with comedies such as The Farmer's Wife or Rich and Strange feeling very distinct from the style he'd come to hone. Rather, this era is more about Hitchcock learning the fundamentals, how to tell a story visually, how to create suspense on screen, how to generate emotion through editing. This growth was somewhat stunted by the advent of sound cinema, but Hitchcock did quickly learn how to use sound as a further tool in his filmmaking arsenal. With his technical competence established, Hitchcock moved into Phase 2, the Little British Thrillers. This phase really starts with The Man Who Knew Too Much, which Hitchcock described to Francois Truffaut as the real start of his career. This is the film that first marked Alfred Hitchcock as the maker of thrillers, a reputation solidified with further classics like The 39 Steps and The Lady Vanishes, with such films setting the stage for his eventual moniker as the master of suspense. More than that though, it is here where key Hitchcockian traits begin to really take form. The notion of ordinary people thrust into dangerous situations, the use of MacGuffins to drive the plot, the wrong man formula where an innocent is pursued for a crime he didn't commit, the elaborate suspense set pieces, with an emphasis on the contrast between what the character knows and what the audience knows. These are all major attributes that have defined Hitchcock's filmography, and it is in the Little British Thrillers that we see their development. In addition to his creative growth, the Little British Thrillers were also hugely popular, elevating Hitchcock from a burgeoning young talent to a box office draw in his own right. Such success caught the attention of Hollywood, and quickly led to Phase 3, David O. Selznick and American Prestige. Hitchcock signed with American mega-producer David O. Selznick, and in addition to their 4 film collaborations, Hitchcock was also contracted out during this phase and made a wealth of diverse movies in Hollywood. There are definitely some outliers here, like the screwball comedy Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or the Seabound Lifeboat, but the overriding trend here is Hitchcock being given more money and resources, allowing him to push the technical competence of the little British thrillers to full-blown technical mastery. Consider the lavish art direction in Rebecca, the precise framing of Shadow of a Doubt, the effects work of Spellbound, the complex cinematography of Notorious, and the first-rate performances found in all of these films. But perhaps more important than Hitchcock's growing craftsmanship during this phase was his growing complexity. Hitchcock was still making thrillers, and those classic Hitchcockian elements are indeed at play, but the suspense comes less from external threats to life and limb, and more from a psychological angle. Notorious is probably the clearest example of this. Though the premise does involve spy work, this itself is largely a MacGuffin, an excuse to move the plot along. The real tension comes from the relationship dynamics, how Devlin projects his insecurities on Alicia, how Alicia internalizes the judgment and scorn levied against her by the men in her life, how Alex's love and adoration for Alicia gives way to insecurity and eventually violent disdain. This is the real heart of Notorious. The threat isn't that Alicia will be exposed as an American agent, but as unfaithful and unloving. This runs through much of Hitchcock's early prestige work, with our focus more towards the character's emotional state. In Shadow of a Doubt, it's not just that Charlie is in danger from her deranged uncle, but that her idyllic view of the man, and the world more broadly, has been shattered. The physical peril of a Hitchcockian thriller is still necessary, but more as a means toward exploring emotional change, rather than as an end in and of itself. Such changes bring with it better characters, more compellingly drawn figures with greater depth, rife with internal conflict. Some prime Hitchcockian themes also start to unfold. Male weakness, insecurity, obsession, and a perverse attraction to violence all become major preoccupations for Hitchcock. Consider how the plot of Notorious is driven almost entirely by two men poorly coping with their own insecurities. How obsession defines the three principal characters of Rebecca in some form or another. How the small-town values of Shadow of a Doubt thinly veil a fascination with horror and violence. These films weren't just pieces of escapism, but works which interrogated psychological and social concerns. In spite of the artistic strides made in this period, Hitchcock felt stifled by the overbearing Selznick and desired to break free. After a relatively unpleasant shoot on the Paradine case, easily Hitchcock's worst film from this period, Hitchcock finally got his wish, beginning Phase 4, Independence and Experimentation. In truth, this is the hardest phase of Hitchcock's career to really define. The immediate break from Selznick was not entirely kind to Hitchcock, whose only unbridled triumph from this period is Strangers on a Train, which is admittedly one of his best films. Otherwise, the films from this period tend to be interesting, if not fully formed. I could have just as easily called this the miscellaneous years, but instead, I'm choosing to foreground the experiments Hitchcock undertook. What's interesting is how these experiments lay the groundwork for what was to come. We can see the single apartment location of Rope in Dial M for Murder and Rear Window, the long takes of Rope and Under Capricorn in the haunting cinematography of Vertigo, the supposed wrong man who's really the villain of Stage Fright in the morally gray protagonists of Vertigo and Psycho, and the almost entirely internal conflict at the forefront of I Confess foreshadows future Hitchcock leads. Consider too the murder scenes of Strangers on a Train. Set pieces and murder had long been Hitchcock tropes by the time of his Patricia Highsmith adaptation, but it's here that Hitchcock sets the standard of a long, arduous build-up, climaxed with quick and brutal death, a scene template we'd see echoed in Hitchcock's work many times thereafter. Such experimentation set the stage for Phase 5, the Golden Age. Unquestionably, these years were the peak of Hitchcock's career, both commercially and artistically. Most of Hitchcock's most iconic films come from this period. Rear Window, Dial M for Murder, Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, The Birds, all of the major titles that people typically bring up when talking Hitchcock. A lot of these films were also massive financial triumphs for the day, particularly Psycho. Such monumental success, coupled with the television show Alfred Hitchcock Presents, solidified the master of suspense as a household name and the recognizable author behind his films. Hitchcock's popularity was also matched by the artistic strides the director made in this period. On a technical level, Hitchcock is in top form here, creating some of his most beautiful imagery, suspenseful set pieces, and haunting moments. Crucial to this is Hitchcock's collaborators, as it was in this age that Hitchcock found his core creative partners: cinematographer Robert Burks, editor George Tomasini, costume designer Edith Head, and perhaps most crucially, composer Bernard Herrmann. These men and women were critical in defining the look and feel of the classic Hitchcock movie, and did some of the best work of their career in this period. More generally, the Golden Age also feels like the culmination of everything Hitchcock had been working towards his whole career. Hitchcock always understood that film was a visual medium, and that at their best did not need dialogue to tell a story. We see this masterfully in Rear Window, where simply cutting between Jeffries and what he sees tells the bulk of the story, or in the highly ambitious tailing scene in Vertigo, where Hitchcock lays out a tantalizing mystery while simultaneously communicating Scotty's burgeoning obsession with Madeline over the course of a 20-minute dialogueless scene that simply observes the behavior of both characters. Hitchcock's interest in dramatic set pieces culminates in action classics like the crop duster in North by Northwest, and of all Hitchcock's murder scenes, there's one undisputed king. The Golden Age also sees general Hitchcock themes come to a sort of endpoint. North by Northwest is undoubtedly the ultimate wrong man thriller, while Hitchcock's interest in ordinary people dealing with extraordinary circumstances sees an extreme end in The Birds. The juxtaposition of wholesome Americana with gruesome violence explored in Shadow of a Doubt evolves into Rear Window, where a perverse obsession with murder enraptures the everyday heroes, and even reconciles the romance between our leads. Indeed, the casting of James Stewart, face of common America in so many Frank Capra films, further reinforces the exposing of idyllic America's dark underbelly. Vertigo plunges even deeper, with Stewart's seemingly wholesome hero slowly revealing hidden levels of depravity. Finally, the core themes of obsession, voyeurism, and male weakness first developed in Hitchcock's prestige pictures find their peak in Rear Window, Vertigo, and Psycho. All three narratives about sexually frustrated male voyeurs whose obsession eventually attracts them to violence in some form or another. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and so too did Hitchcock's Golden Age. Following the astronomical success of Psycho, subsequent Hitchcock efforts, no matter how successful, failed to capture the zeitgeist in quite the same way, with such a slow decline eventually leading to Phase 6, The Dark Ages. Beginning in 1966 with Torn Curtain, and ending 10 years later with Family Plot, The Dark Ages span Hitchcock's final 4 films, with each trying to recapture the glory of Hitchcock's past. Even at their best, though, none of these films were ever fully able to recapture the majesty of Hitchcock's Golden Age. The question is, what happened? How did Hitchcock go from his creative peak to his creative low point in such a short time span? To answer this, we need to talk about Marnie. Part 2, Marnie. So of all the contentious statements I made in my Hitchcock categorizing, I'm gonna guess including Marnie in the Golden Age is among the most questionable. To be sure, Marnie is a flawed piece of work. Chief among the film's problems are its confusing sexual politics. Much of the film is structured around wealthy industrialist Mark forcing Marnie into a romantic relationship against her will. But the film can't decide whether Mark is an oppressive villain or a hero who knows what's best for the poor victimized heroine. These issues go back to the screenwriting process. Original screenwriter Evan Hunter clashed with Hitchcock on the depiction of Mark and Marnie's relationship, most notably resisting adapting the rape scene from the original novel. Hitchcock disagreed, and while Hunter was eventually replaced by J. Presson Allen, the confusing ideas surrounding Marnie's central relationship remain in the final product. The other big issue with Marnie is a simpler one, but one which would haunt Hitchcock throughout the Dark Ages: diminishing returns. The film is very much caught in the shadow of prior Hitchcock triumphs, namely Vertigo. Both films deal with men who obsess over a woman, attempting to control and change her. Both films are about protagonists who are haunted by their past, and climax with the protagonist confronting said past. Hell, both films use a color motif to suggest their protagonist's state of mind. Consider too Bernard Herrmann's music for both films. Pretty fucking similar, right? Of course, Hitchcock had always drawn on the well of his prior work, but this was the first time that the well had yielded substantially less water. For as much as Marnie wants to be Vertigo, it just doesn't measure up. While Vertigo is pretty clearly a story about how a man's obsession and desire to control the woman he loves leads to ruin for her and himself, Marnie is a lot more muddled. One would think the film is about the consequences of sexual abuse, given Marnie's backstory, but the film also ends with Marnie in the loving embrace of her rapist after he has helped her through her trauma. And yet, I don't think the film is trying to suggest that a hysterical woman simply needs a firm man to set her straight, given the film does depict Mark's actions towards Marnie as being oppressive and harmful. So the overall arc of the film is confusing. But even if you do set aside the film's confused sexual politics, the central relationship just isn't that interesting. We never get a real sense of why Mark is so obsessed with Marnie, and more to the point, the relationship is largely stagnant for the second half of the film. Marnie is frigid and doesn't like to be touched, Mark gets mad and probes Marnie's past, the two fight. We see that dynamic play out over and over again, without the relationship actually changing. Compare that to Vertigo, where each scene between Scotty and Madeline either reveals new insights into the characters and the relationship, or alters the dynamic between the two. The suspense and drama stems from knowing what each character wants, and how that influences the relationship. But in Marnie, we never fully know the characters, and the relationship doesn't advance enough to maintain interest. So why am I still placing Marnie in Hitchcock's golden age? Well, whatever its flaws, Marnie does feel more at peace with Hitchcock's peak than his plateau. Thematically, the film fits in nicely with what Hitch was doing in his prime, continuing to explore ideas of obsession, sex, and a desire to control women. Marnie also features some excellent Hitchcockian set pieces. This scene in particular is classic Hitchcock, simply and elegantly putting Marnie into unknowing danger and milking the tension for all it's worth. The shot choices perfectly communicate Marnie's situation and thinking, and Hitch is able to raise the tension to a fever pitch before ending on a clever reveal.
You're sure making time tonight, reader. What's the big rush?
I want to get to bed, that's the big rush.
I also love the titular character's on-screen introduction, which wordlessly emphasizes her status as a thief and her professionalism, while Herman's score builds to an epic peak. On that note, remember that super team of Hitchcock collaborators which came together during the Golden Age? Marnie was their final film project together, and their great work does come through. The film looks beautiful, has some wonderfully put together sequences, and even if Herman's score is a retread of his work on Vertigo, it's still an amazing collection of music. For all Marnie's flaws, the film still shows Hitchcock at the top of his game technically, while the film's themes and aesthetics place it well within Hitchcock's golden age. But this is the end of the golden age, and it would not be Marnie's accomplishments, but its shortcomings that would plague Hitchcock's work moving forward. Part 3. Torn Curtain. Hitchcock's golden age may extend to 1964, but the decline definitely started post-Psycho. 1963's The Birds was certainly also a success critically and financially, but it wasn't the monumental triumph of Psycho. A year later, Marnie hit screens, and while I do think the artistry of the film aligns it with the golden age, the film divided critics and was generally not a box office success. Hitchcock was slowly losing his touch, and at the same time, a new breed of thriller was finding success. Movies like The Manchurian Candidate, 7 Days in May, and Failsafe were pushing the boundaries of the then modern thriller. Not only did such films raise the stakes to a national level, but they also took on the politics of the day far more openly than Hitchcock ever did. And these movies did inspire the master of suspense. And there was also this other spy series that started to take off in the 60s. Taking influence from Hitchcock thrillers like North by Northwest, the James Bond movies were pushing spy intrigue and adventure to absurd new heights. Hitchcock was somewhat resentful at how bluntly the series was riffing on his own work, but he was also fascinated by the films. Influence from both dark political thrillers like The Manchurian Candidate and the comic book world of 007 seeped into Hitchcock's next film, which sought to combine the reality of the former with the fantastical thrills of the latter. That film would become 1966's Torn Curtain. Torn Curtain was likely a compromise project from the start. It's not that the notion of making a realistic Bond is inherently flawed. Hell, From Russia with Love alone proves it can be done. I think the deeper issue here is that Torn Curtain sees a Hitchcock lacking inspiration. No longer the pioneer, Hitch is now chasing trends. That lack of passion and originality can be felt throughout the film. Scene construction is generally competent, but the set pieces lack creativity. The scenes generally follow Hitchcock's rules on suspense to the letter, but there isn't enough cleverness or ingenuity for them to really pop. Take the climactic scene, where our heroes unknowingly become surrounded by enemy soldiers and eventually realize they need to escape. Classic Hitchcock setup, but the camera angles don't denote a sense of danger, and at a certain point, the addition of yet more soldiers into the scene stops to carry weight. When the characters finally realize they're trapped, this is their solution. Admittedly, this is a decently clever way out of a tricky scenario, but cinematically, it's rather lackluster, as the scene just ends with crowds rushing out of the theater, and it certainly doesn't satisfy as the climax to a spy thriller. To the film's credit, there is one really awesome murder scene which depicts brutal violence accentuated by the lack of music, but it's the exceptional scene in a sea of mediocrity. Ultimately, while the set pieces are by and large not among Hitchcock's best, they could have worked, as they have the core ingredients. The problem is the characters. At the behest of Universal and producer Lew Wasserman, Hitchcock was encouraged to shake up his usual creative team. Starting with the cast, Torn Curtain features younger, hipper leads in Paul Newman and Julie Andrews. Great talents to be sure, but neither quite gelled with Hitchcock. Andrews met Hitchcock early in pre-production, but Hitch never totally got Andrews' appeal, and her character's role was gradually diminished. Paul Newman, on the other hand, had great admiration for Hitchcock, but Newman's style of subdued method acting clashed with the theatrical performances Hitchcock favored, and Hitchcock's direction, which emphasized action and visuals over internal motivation. The results are largely stilted performances, dull characters, and a couple lacking any real chemistry. Not only do the relationship dynamics between the pair fail to resonate, but on the most basic level, the characters are just not engaging, and that makes it difficult to invest in the suspense. Perhaps more severe than the casting choices were the changes made to Hitchcock's core creative lineup. Remember that super team I praised in the Golden Age? Well, it finally dissolved here, with only costume designer Edith Head remaining. Editor George Tomasini passed away after Marnie, cinematographer Robert Burks was unavailable, and composer Bernard Herrmann left over creative differences with Hitchcock and Universal. The absence of all three men is felt throughout. The cutting in Torn Curtain is far slower and less inspired, contributing to the film's lethargic pacing. Burks' lush and beautiful color cinematography is replaced by much softer lighting and weak colors which generally lack the vivid beauty of Hitchcock's Golden Age. And then there's Herrmann's music. Put simply, to go from this to this just fucking sucks. Composer John Addison's work isn't bad, but where Herrmann's music perfectly complemented Hitchcock and created wonderful layers of emotion and drama, Addison's is just another movie score. And really, that sums up most of the differences brought on by Hitchcock losing his core team. It's not that the new filmmakers were bad at their jobs, but the poetry of the Golden Age was clearly gone, giving way to something more standard. Torn Curtain was one of Hitchcock's most unhappy shoots, with the director being unsatisfied with most of the work done and the final product. This lack of enthusiasm was matched by critics, who by and large saw Torn Curtain as a dud. The most common criticisms were that the film felt old-fashioned, was a repetition of prior and better Hitchcock films, and that the film was just dull. That last criticism is easily Torn Curtain's biggest sin. It's just kind of boring.
Do something!
The filmmaking shows a basic competence at all levels, but it's just not an involving story, with Hitchcock's lack of interest oozing off the screen. Though a minor box office success, Hitchcock did view Torn Curtain as a failure. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. Part 4, Topaz. Hitchcock remained determined to make his realistic Bond movie, following Torn Curtain with yet another spy thriller, the 1969 film Topaz, a story loosely based on the events which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Hitch was not blind to the faults of his previous film, and took clear steps to fix things this time around. Deliberate efforts were made to shoot more on location, rather than the phony sets and projected backgrounds of Torn Curtain. Real-life politics were more fully integrated into the story, and Hitchcock opted for a collection of lesser-known character actors rather than chasing celebrity. On paper, these all sound like good choices, but the resulting film failed to meet expectations. Topaz is a truly bad movie, easily the worst of Hitchcock's Dark Ages, and quite possibly the worst film of his career. The film is a tedious mess, bogged down by unnecessary details, subplots, and characters which muddle the story. Some sequences are well done in isolation, but Topaz is so lacking in character, humor, or excitement that it becomes a slog to get through. Add to that poor test screenings leading to a slap-together ending so anticlimactic that it's straight up hilarious, and you've got yourself one bad movie.
Anyway, that's the end of Topaz.
So what the hell happened? How did Hitchcock's noble intentions eventually amount to possibly his greatest failure? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I think among the most crucial is Hitchcock misunderstanding his own skills. In his effort to make a realistic spy thriller, Hitchcock lost sight of the fact that the spy narratives in his own film were never the main draw. Notorious isn't beloved for its intricate espionage or political insight, but for the intense relationship dynamics between the three leads. I'm not going to act like the spy elements aren't important, as they do drive the plot and provide a heightened background for the emotional sparring, but it is the characters and their feelings which take priority. I care about Alicia, about Devlin, hell, I even care about Alex. I'm deeply invested in what's going to happen to all three characters, and how their psychology will affect their choices. And you compare that to Topaz, where I don't even know what these people's names are. Hitchcock is so concerned with presenting a realistic spy thriller that he completely fails to adequately develop his characters. For a film that's so concerned with details, it never provides the most important one: a reason to care. In attempting to move past other old Hollywood conventions, Hitchcock stumbles. I can certainly admire Hitchcock's efforts to move past the artifice of Hollywood sound stages and rear screen projection, but their absence only emphasizes how much Hitchcock relied on such techniques in the first place. Most of Hitchcock's classic films may have been obviously stage-bound, but such a controlled environment allowed Hitchcock a mastery over blocking and cinematography that created drama and suspense. The environments of Topaz might feel more realistic, but at the cost of the meticulous staging Hitchcock films had previously prided themselves on. The lack of major stars is also an issue. Hitchcock may have resented the steep prices that came with using celebrities, but the fact is his movies benefited from star power. As a director of actors, Hitchcock always prioritized the moment-to-moment look of a performer rather than the internal psychology of the character. In this regard, it helped that Hitchcock used actors that were associated with a certain type of performance. One look at them, and the viewer would have an idea about who their character was and what they were experiencing. But in Topaz, the cast is made up of smaller character actors who don't exude the same larger-than-life personality as a Grace Kelly or a Jimmy Stewart. And that's no disrespect to the cast, mind you. I love John Vernon, dude played Rupert Thorne in Batman the Animated Series. And who could forget Roscoe Lee Brown, dude played Kingpin in Spider-Man the Animated Series. Rather, the issue is the lack of instantly readable actors, which, combined with the overpopulated script and underdeveloped characters, further hinders audience engagement. It must be stressed that all these issues were only magnified by Hitchcock's incredibly poor health at the time of filming. Hitchcock had been overweight for most of his career, but his body really deteriorated in the years following Marnie, while his mental health was in equally rough shape. Following the death of George Tomasini, a series of other Hitchcock collaborators and friends also passed away, including cinematographer Robert Burks, whose death is said to have weighed especially heavily on Hitchcock. This, in conjunction with his own declining health, led to a Hitchcock who was constantly fatigued and obsessed with the thought of death. Such factors certainly affected the man's competency on set, and indeed, Topaz was Hitchcock's second miserable shoot in a row. When Topaz finally hit theaters in December of 1969, the film was generally seen as a failure. Though the film did and does have its supporters, most reviews criticized the film for being really boring, and financially, the film was a disappointment. Such a failure couldn't have come at a worse time. Not only had Hitchcock failed to live up to the spy films he was riffing on or his own legacy, but it's also important to consider the emergence of the new Hollywood. Between Torn Curtain and Topaz, Hollywood saw a rise of a new type of film, which challenged the conventional wisdom of old Hollywood. These were movies that pushed the boundaries of sex and violence in American cinema, were influenced by European techniques in cinematography and editing, and resonated with young audiences by speaking to contemporary social and political concerns while showing a flagrant rebellion against the status quo. You compare that to Topaz, with its dull pacing, flat characters, and general lack of excitement, and it just shows how out of touch and old-fashioned Hitchcock was. Cinema had moved past the master of suspense, and there just wasn't a place for Alfred Hitchcock movies anymore. Or so it seemed. Part 5, Frenzy. As it turns out, the monumental failure of Topaz was exactly the defeat Hitchcock needed to kick his ass into gear. Motivated by his losses, Hitchcock worked hard to improve his health and return to work on a new picture. And this time, he wouldn't be chasing trends. Rather than trying to craft a realistic spy movie or keep up with the successes of James Bond, Hitchcock instead gravitated toward a low-key murder story, one which would even take him back to England. That film would become Frenzy, Hitchcock's final triumph. Frenzy is a return to form for Hitchcock, and easily the best film of his dark ages. Unlike the muddled stories and lifeless characters of Torn Curtain and Topaz, Frenzy tells a simple, engaging story which combines a murder mystery with a wrong man thriller. The characters are all distinct and interesting, a high degree of tension is maintained throughout, the film has a good sense of humor, and there are a handful of very chilling set pieces. The key to the film's success is its back-to-basics approach, as we see Hitchcock returning to a lot of his core themes. We've got ourselves an innocent man hunted down by the law, a perverse obsession with murder, sexual violence, desire to dominate women, suspenseful set pieces, and a dark, sly sense of humor. Basically all of the elements that Hitchcock had mastered throughout his career. But at the same time, Frenzy is not just a retread of old ideas. Most obviously, the death of the Hollywood production code allowed Hitchcock to really push the limit on sex and violence in ways he couldn't before. The results are some very unique set pieces, notably a truly macabre scene where the killer has to remove a personal artifact from the corpse of a victim. Then there's the film's first murder, which shows the antagonist's violence in long, excruciating detail. The scene is nearly unbearable in its own right, but it also has an echo effect which runs through the rest of the film and aids the suspense. A later scene, where the killer lures an unsuspecting victim to her death, is highly suspenseful, not only because we know he's the killer and she's in danger, but because we've seen just how graphic and unpleasant his killings are. So confident is Hitchcock that he doesn't even show this murder. Instead, the camera slowly glides back out the hall, as if sadly accepting what's going to happen. But it's not just the violence or sex which has changed. Frenzy plays as if Hitchcock took his classic wrong man storytelling and dragged it through a vat of 70s sleaze. Where the prototypical wrong men of yesteryear tended to be handsome charmers, Frenzy's hero is kind of a shit. He's short-tempered, he's rude.
Let me help you.
Leave me alone.
And while I wouldn't exactly call the dude ugly, he's no Cary Grant. And that goes for the rest of the cast too. While most of Hitchcock's Hollywood movies are full of beautiful celebrity types, the people in Frenzy are a lot weirder looking, with more aggressive facial features and lighting which emphasizes plainness over beauty. On that note, the film's visual style is a lot rougher than the Golden Age, with harsher lighting and a lot less color. This definitely does not have the same meticulous control as a Rear Window or a Vertigo, but that's entirely appropriate for this story. Even the humor is more grotesque. This aforementioned set piece is both horrific and vile, but it's also kind of hilarious. Hitch is able to find great bits of slapstick comedy in a scene which is also gross and tense. In sum, Frenzy takes all the classic Hitchcock elements that he'd been developing since the Rookie years and breathes new life into them, recontextualizing an Alfred Hitchcock film for modern times. I'm not going to pretend like Frenzy is some inaccessible masterpiece, because it certainly isn't. The story takes some time to really get cooking, and I'm also not sure what Hitch was thinking with the score. Beyond that though, for as successful as the film is as a stylistic exercise, it does lack the depth and intrigue of Hitchcock's best works. So is Frenzy top tier Hitchcock? Not really, but it certainly was a return to form for the master of suspense, and the critics of the day largely supported the sentiment. Frenzy was seen as a major comeback following a string of misses, and the film also proved a sizable financial hit. Hitchcock had proven that he could in fact thrive in the new Hollywood, and any notion that a Hitchcockian thriller was simply outdated was put to rest. But Hitchcock was still an old man, and his health could only hold out so long. Part 6. Family Plot. Frenzy should have been Hitchcock's last movie. The film returned to core Hitchcockian elements while simultaneously modernizing them, effectively proving that a Hitchcock film could work in the new Hollywood. His 50-second film, released 50 years after his first official directing job, the production brought Hitch back to his home of England, and even led to working with actress Elsie Randolph, who had a role in Hitchcock's 1931 film Rich and Strange some 40 years earlier. Collaborators, the folks at Universal, and most film journalists all seem to view Frenzy as Hitchcock's swan song. The only person who didn't seem to get the memo was Alfred Hitchcock, who insisted throughout interviews that he had no plans to retire. And so, Hitchcock soldiered on, eventually delivering 1976's Family Plot, a light caper about a psychic and her boyfriend investigating a missing heir, and a pair of criminals who've kidnapped a bishop. The film is neither a grand triumph in the vein of Frenzy, nor a large-scale failure like Topaz. No, more than anything, Family Plot is just mediocre, a watchable piece of fluff that would be entirely forgotten were it not the final film from one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. Trouble started with the screenplay, with Hitchcock clashing with North by Northwest scribe Ernest Lehman increasingly throughout production. That likely didn't help, but the story here generally works, effectively bringing together two seemingly very disparate plot lines, and the characters are all pretty distinct and colorful personalities, so I don't think it's accurate to pin all the movie's woes on the screenplay. I think the real culprit here is something far simpler: Hitchcock's declining health. Though Hitchcock had entered frenzy and fine health, it didn't take long for his body to begin to break down again. Hitchcock even suffered a heart attack while working on the screenplay for Family Plot and was fitted with a pacemaker. By the time filming began, Hitchcock was under the strict care of doctors and studio officials, and that sense of fatigue is all over Family Plot. Hitchcock's direction isn't exactly bad, but the precise visual storytelling that Hitch had prided himself on is largely absent. Most of the plot is relayed through long dialogue scenes, typically in either basic shot reverse shot, flat two shots, or a series of medium close-ups. It's functional, but never anything more than that, and that's ultimately the film's greatest sin. Family Plot just isn't very cinematic. Say what you will about something like Topaz, but at least it felt like a movie. There's at least some degree of visual creativity in there, and while I can't tell you what any of these characters' names are, I at least remember some of the film's visuals. But with Family Plot, it's largely perfunctory. Family Plot is a very talky affair, but it does occasionally attempt a set piece, usually to underwhelming results. This car chase is probably the film's most famous scene, and not for good reasons. The scene is all the more embarrassing when you consider that around the same time, we had scenes like this. Alright, that's not a totally fair comparison, given that this sequence is largely played for laughs, but that in itself is suggestive of how far Hitchcock had fallen. Playing the scene as a joke just feels like a concession that Hitchcock can no longer compete and he's not even gonna try.
I gotta get off this road.
Other set pieces fare a little bit better. This sequence starts off nicely, echoing Marnie's classic introduction, but then the power dynamic is thrown off with the cop towering over Fran, while shots like this don't carry any sense of menace. When Fran turns the gun on these guys, they don't even look scared, and when Fran weighs the diamond, we don't get a reaction shot of the men looking nervous. Consequently, the audience understands that a robbery is taking place, but none of the characters seem invested, and thus the scene fails to produce an emotional reaction. It's not a bad scene, but it is a flat one. Of course, the film isn't all bad. The actors all do a pretty good job here, especially Barbara Harris, who is absolutely delightful whenever she's on screen. The deliberately convoluted story is also a fairly engaging yarn, even if it isn't told in the most exciting way. And this late struggle between Arthur and Blanche is genuinely a pretty tense scene. Taken as a whole though, Family Plot just feels tired. Hitchcock's magic spark behind the camera just isn't there, and sadly, it'd never come back, as Family Plot would be the last Alfred Hitchcock film. Hitchcock continued to workshop ideas, and his office at Universal would remain open for a few years yet, but it was clear to everyone that Hitchcock would never direct again. 4 years after Family Plot, Alfred Hitchcock passed away at 80 years old. In analyzing Hitchcock's final 4 films, 3 main factors emerge which emphasize why the great filmmaker struggled in his twilight years. First, burnout. Not only did Hitchcock turn out a ridiculous number of high-quality content across film and television for decades, but he also established what an Alfred Hitchcock movie was so effectively that it ultimately became a constraint. To quote Hitchcock in his seminal interview with Francois Truffaut, "I suppose I'm limited to a certain field. How long can a filmmaker go on painting the same picture?" Years later, in a letter to Truffaut, Hitchcock lamented that he, quote, "can only make what is expected of me. That is, a thriller or a suspense story, and that I find hard to do." Simply put, the dude had spent a lifetime mastering a certain type of story, and by the time he got around to movies like Torn Curtain and Topaz, he lacked inspiration. This also helps to explain the outlier success of Frenzy, as the dissolution of the production code and the rising sleaze of 70s cinema re-energized the man. It let him do something new. The second factor was the changing landscape of American cinema in the 1960s and 70s. I originally theorized that this was indeed the principal factor in informing Hitchcock's Dark Ages. Unless your name is John Huston, most of the old Hollywood filmmakers struggled to remain relevant in the wake of movies like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate, and Hitchcock was no exception. Compared to the new Hollywood that was emerging, most of Hitchcock's work felt old-fashioned in style and substance. But in actual fact, while the new Hollywood was definitely a challenge for Hitchcock, it was not in itself the end. Frenzy pretty clearly demonstrates that Hitchcock films could adapt to the times and thrive. Consider too the success of Brian De Palma, whose films from the 1970s openly riff on Hitchcock's work and feel remarkably similar to Frenzy. These sensibilities were not themselves archaic. New Hollywood was a hurdle that Hitchcock had to overcome, but so too was the transition from silent to sound film. He could do it, but what he couldn't do was transcend his own age. This is the third, and ultimately most important reason for informing Hitchcock's Dark Ages. By the 1960s, the dude was an out-of-shape old man, and saw a notable decline in his physical and mental health during this period. His body saw rapid deterioration, and the specter of death loomed largely over Hitch as friends and collaborators passed away while his own body withered. And at the end of the day, there's really no getting around these problems. No matter how inspired Hitchcock was, no matter what he did to adapt to the new Hollywood, there's no overcoming mortality. So how should we contextualize Hitchcock's Dark Ages with the rest of his career? Are these films just a sad rough patch that is better left alone? Absolutely not. While most of the films here aren't really good, they do provide fascinating insights into the man himself. To watch these films is to get a glimpse into how Hitchcock contended with a creative slump, changing times, and declining health. That's often a sad experience, but still a valuable one. This period is also critical to understanding Hitchcock's evolution as an artist, and to understand his weaknesses is to gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of his strengths. And if nothing else, there's always Frenzy. The fact that even in what is undoubtedly the low point in his career, where he struggled with personal crisis and mass industry change, Alfred Hitchcock could still make something that surprised audiences? Well, that's pretty wonderful.